The news broke like a storm no one was ready for. Cameras flashed, reporters trembled, and a nation fell silent as Prince William stepped forward, his face pale, his voice heavy with heartbreak. "My father's condition has worsened," he said, words that echoed through the hearts of millions. Behind the palace gates, the future of the monarchy stood on trembling ground. King Charles, the man who carried the weight of a nation with grace and endurance, now fights a battle time refuses to spare. What happens next could change the royal family forever. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind this devastating announcement. The hidden struggle, the tears behind the walls, and the farewell Britain fears to face. It began quietly, as these things often do, not with an announcement, not with a statement, but with a feeling. Something unseen had shifted within Buckingham Palace. The morning air, usually filled with the hum of routine, now carried an edge of unease. Guards exchanged glances. Aides walked briskly through corridors, their footsteps echoing in rhythm with tension. The royal press office remained silent, and that silence spoke louder than any words could. The world had grown used to royal precision, to perfectly timed briefings and carefully measured phrases. But now, nothing came. No schedule, no smiles, no reassurance, only closed doors and unanswered questions. The first hints appeared in whispers among the palace staff. Curtains had been drawn in the king's private wing earlier than usual. Medical personnel, who normally moved discreetly, were seen entering through the side entrance reserved for emergencies. Senior aides were called into meetings without explanation, their faces tight with worry. What had begun as a faint ripple of rumor began to swell into something larger, a tide of fear that moved quietly through the palace halls. By midday, even the most experienced correspondents sensed it. Something was wrong with the king. Outside the palace gates, tourists gathered as they always did, snapping photos, unaware of the gravity behind the iron railings. But reporters noticed the changes, the muted tones of the guards, the unusual restriction of the press area, the sudden absence of the usual royal briefings. For a family that lived under constant scrutiny, silence was its own kind of alarm. Each hour that passed without an update deepened the nation's worry. News networks began to speculate. Was the king ill? Had there been a relapse? Why had Prince William cancelled his scheduled appearance without warning? Inside the palace, the atmosphere grew heavier. Camilla, poised and composed as ever, was seen speaking quietly with a private secretary. Her expression betrayed nothing, but those nearby felt the strain in the air. In another part of the building, Prince William had been summoned urgently from Windsor. The corridors that had once echoed with ceremonial grandeur now pulsed with the quiet urgency of a family bracing for news they did not want to hear. The palace is a place built to contain emotion, but that day, its walls could not hold it. The staff moved carefully, aware that even a single misplaced word might reach the world before the family was ready. The king had been unwell before. The public knew this. But the tone this time was different. Those closest to him could see it in the doctor's eyes, in the measured way they spoke, in the quiet between their words. As evening fell, the palace lights glowed faintly against the London skyline. But behind them was only uncertainty. The great building seemed to breathe in long, uneasy sighs, its windows flickering with movement and shadow. Outside the gates, a crowd had gathered, drawn by instinct and fear. They waited, listening for any sign, a statement, a sound, a glimpse of truth, but none came. Only silence. And in that silence, the whisper began to spread. The king's condition had taken a devastating turn. The world would soon know what those palace walls already feared. It was just past midnight when the phone rang inside Windsor Castle. The sound was sharp and unwelcome, cutting through the stillness of the royal residence. Prince William had been reviewing correspondence for an upcoming engagement when his aide appeared at the door, his face pale and his posture tense. The moment William answered, the voice on the other end spoke softly, too calmly for what it carried. There were no dramatic words, only a carefully phrased message from Buckingham Palace. The king's condition had worsened. For a moment, William said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and cold, until he finally whispered, "I'll be there within the hour." The call ended, but its echo lingered. Catherine appeared almost instantly, already knowing. She had seen that look before, the same one he wore the night they learned of the Queen's passing. Without words, she reached for his hand. They moved quickly but quietly, like two people walking through a dream they wished to wake from. Outside, the castle grounds were drenched in darkness, the faint mist curling around the lamps as if nature itself understood the weight of the night. Within minutes, the couple's car was ready. The driver said nothing as the gates opened, and they sped into the empty roads. The world outside was asleep, unaware that within those quiet miles, history was shifting once again. William stared out the window, his thoughts tangled between fear and duty. He remembered his father's voice earlier that week, weary but still determined, insisting that he was fine, insisting that the nation must not worry. Now those reassurances felt like echoes from another time. Catherine sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her hand resting gently on his arm. There were no words to offer comfort when the heart already knew the truth it feared. Back at Buckingham Palace, lights flickered in windows that rarely glowed at such an hour. Staff moved briskly, whispers filling the hallways. A private medical team had been summoned to the king's quarters, and senior aides waited in somber stillness outside his door. The atmosphere was unlike anything they had felt before, not the controlled urgency of royal protocol, but the raw human stillness of waiting for fate to speak. When the car arrived at the palace gates, the guards stepped aside without question. Cameras had begun to gather at a distance, but even the press seemed hesitant, as though the gravity of the night had silenced their pursuit. The nation did not yet know what was happening, but the tension had already begun to spread. Social media was filled with speculation. News networks shifted to live coverage, and the phrase "royal emergency" began to trend before dawn. Inside, William and Catherine walked through the corridors hand in hand. The echo of their footsteps mingled with the soft hum of machines beyond the closed doors. William's face was pale, his eyes hollowed by sleepless worry. He knew that beyond those walls lay not only his father, but the man who had carried a crown through storms of expectation and duty. The heir had arrived, but not as a prince stepping into a ceremony. He had come as a son, summoned by love and by the quiet realization that the moment every monarch dreads might be near. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing the world outside. The air in the king's private chamber was heavy, perfumed faintly with antiseptic and the faint aroma of lavender oil that the staff used to soothe him. Machines murmured in quiet rhythm, their beeping steady but frail, marking each fragile heartbeat of a man who had once carried the weight of an empire. Prince William stood motionless for a moment, his eyes fixed on the still figure in the bed. The crown might belong to the state, but the man lying there was his father, and that truth pressed harder on his chest than any royal title ever could. King Charles stirred at the sound of his son's footsteps. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes dimmed by fatigue but still bright with recognition. A faint smile crossed his lips, small and pained, yet filled with affection. "You came," he whispered, his voice dry as parchment. William moved closer, pulling the chair to the bedside. "Of course I came," he answered softly, his throat tightening. He reached for his father's hand, surprised by how light it felt in his own. The strength that once commanded nations, now reduced to the tremor of fragile fingers. For a while, neither spoke. The monitors filled the silence, a metronome of mortality counting down seconds too precious to waste. The king's breathing was shallow, but his eyes never left his son's face. Finally, Charles spoke again, his words slow, deliberate, as though each one was carved from the last of his strength. "You must remember, William, duty is not about being loved. It is about enduring when love is misunderstood." His hand tightened weakly, and his voice wavered. "Forgive. Always forgive. The crown is heavy, my boy, but bitterness makes it heavier still." William swallowed hard, fighting the ache rising in his chest. "You have done more than enough," he said quietly. "You do not need to think of duty now." But Charles only smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the window where the faint outline of dawn was beginning to form. "We are never free of it," he murmured. "Not while we live. When the time comes, remember this. The monarchy survives not by power, but by compassion. Promise me you will lead with that." The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls holding their words like sacred vows. William nodded, unable to speak. The king's hand loosened, resting lightly against his son's palm. "I was not always the father you needed," Charles said after a pause, his eyes glistening. "But you have always been the son I hoped for." The words struck something deep within William, something he had buried under layers of responsibility. He leaned forward, his forehead brushing the back of his father's hand. "Rest now," he whispered, his voice barely steady. "I'm here." Outside, the sky began to lighten, pale gold spilling across the horizon. The machines hummed on, steady and gentle, like the final notes of a fading song. In that quiet chamber, a father and son shared not the language of kings, but the fragile honesty of love, the kind spoken only when time is running out. Outside the king's chamber, the palace had become a silent machine, moving with grim efficiency. Couriers hurried through marble corridors carrying sealed envelopes. Telephones rang softly behind closed doors. Every sound seemed muted, as though the building itself understood the gravity of what was unfolding within its walls. Officials spoke in whispers, their expressions unreadable, their movements rehearsed from centuries of royal protocol. Beyond the palace gates, the city of London slept beneath a shroud of uncertainty, unaware that before dawn, the destiny of the monarchy might shift forever. The Prime Minister had already been briefed in the early hours. A confidential message had arrived through official channels, informing him that the king's health had entered a critical stage. His advisors gathered in quiet urgency, discussing constitutional protocols no one wished to enact but all were trained to follow. At Lambeth Palace, senior clergy stood ready, aware that their presence might soon be required not for ceremony, but for prayer. The machinery of the state was preparing for the unthinkable. Yet in one room, far removed from titles and authority, a son sat beside his father and felt the weight of all of it pressing down upon his soul. William had not moved for hours. The low hum of the medical monitors had become part of his heartbeat, steady and relentless. His father slept uneasily, his breathing shallow but rhythmic. The doctors had withdrawn for the night, leaving only the faint scent of antiseptic and the dim light of the bedside lamp. William's eyes were fixed on the crown insignia embroidered on the blanket that covered the king's frail frame. It was an image he had seen his entire life, a symbol of legacy and duty. But tonight, it looked unbearably heavy. Not as an emblem of power, but as a reminder of what it cost. His father's words still echoed in his mind. "The crown is heavy, my boy. It does not rest. It endures." Those had been his exact words earlier in the night, spoken between labored breaths. William had nodded, but now he understood in a way he never had before. It was not just a warning about the monarchy. It was a truth about life, about love, sacrifice, and the quiet burden of responsibility. The heir to the throne felt no pride in the thought of inheritance, only an ache in his chest that no amount of duty could silence. As Charles drifted into restless sleep, his face softened, the lines of years and expectation easing for a moment. William watched him with a tenderness that broke through his composure. The man before him was not the king of the United Kingdom. He was simply his father, the one who had taught him restraint, endurance, and the quiet strength of patience. For the first time, William realized that the crown had always been both a blessing and a curse. It was not a reward, but a weight. He rose slowly, walking toward the window. Outside, the first light of dawn began to wash the palace grounds in a pale silver glow. The city was waking, unaware that its king was slipping deeper into fragility. William pressed a hand against the cold glass and whispered to the morning, "The time for denial is over." In that moment, he understood that the crown was no longer distant. It was already reaching for him. Behind the grandeur of palace walls, a quiet truth had been carefully guarded. While the world saw a steadfast monarch always composed and smiling, those closest to the king knew the struggle that unfolded behind closed doors. It began subtly, a delayed step here, a faint hesitation during an engagement there. The public assumed it was age and natural slowing after decades of service. But the reality was far more devastating. The king's strength was failing, and the illness that doctors once hoped to contain had grown unyielding, advancing beyond their ability to fight it. Each morning, Charles rose before dawn, insisting on reviewing documents, approving briefings, and attending audiences. His aides pleaded with him to rest, but he refused. "The people must never see weakness," he would say, adjusting his cuff links with trembling hands. There were moments when the pain was so sharp that he gripped the edge of his desk to steady himself, his face paling under the effort to conceal it. Yet when the cameras appeared, his smile never faltered. The nation saw its king composed, dutiful, and unwavering, unaware that every step he took cost him more than he could afford to give. In private, his physician spoke of the relentless nature of the disease. It had spread quietly, defying treatment after treatment. The king's resolve became both his armor and his burden. He had sworn during his coronation to serve until his final breath, and to him, that promise was sacred. Even as the fatigue deepened and the nights grew longer, he insisted on performing his duties. He attended ceremonies, read speeches, and received visiting dignitaries. Behind every formal handshake and every photograph was a man waging a battle not against political storms, but against his own body. Catherine once confided to a close friend that she had seen him stumble after a state dinner, catching himself on a nearby chair before anyone noticed. "He smiled and waved," she whispered, and then, when no one was looking, he winced as though a shadow had passed through him. It was in these small, unseen moments that the truth of his suffering became undeniable. William had tried to intervene, suggesting fewer public appearances, but his father refused. "My duty ends when I do," the king replied softly, the words carrying both pride and sorrow. There was a deep nobility in his persistence, but also a quiet tragedy. The same strength that had defined his reign now denied him peace. His devotion to the crown came at the cost of his own well-being. Within the palace, the staff grew used to the rhythm of his endurance. Painkillers taken discreetly before meetings, brief rests between engagements. The royal calendar, still filled, became both a testament to his courage and a map of his decline. He was determined that the world would not see him diminished. He would not let illness steal the dignity that had taken a lifetime to earn. Now, as the truth begins to surface, the public sees not a frail king, but a man who fought until he could fight no more. His hidden battle was not for sympathy, but for legacy, a final act of service that revealed the quiet, unbreakable heart of a monarch who refused to surrender, even as his body did. The news spread through the inner circles of the royal household with the quiet urgency of something sacred. The king's doctors had advised that the family assemble at Balmoral. The message carried no official tone, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Within hours, plans were set in motion. Helicopters were readied. Security tightened. The ancient Scottish estate, long a place of peace and retreat, was about to become the backdrop for one of the most delicate chapters in royal history. Balmoral had witnessed coronations, celebrations, and tragedies alike. And now it waited once again, its stone walls prepared to keep another family secret. Princess and arrived first. Her expression was composed, her stride brisk, her loyalty unwavering as always. Yet as she entered her father's study, the firmness in her voice softened. She had seen her father endure storms of politics and criticism with quiet endurance. But this was different. The king's chair sat empty, the familiar scent of his books and papers filling the room. For the first time in her life, and felt the approaching end of an era she had always believed immovable. Not long after, Edward and Sophie arrived together. They had traveled in near silence, each lost in private prayer. When they entered the castle, the mood shifted again, less formal, more human. Sophie placed a gentle hand on Anne's shoulder. No words were exchanged, but understanding passed between them. The corridors echoed faintly with the sound of their footsteps, reminders that, though royal by title, they were now simply children gathering around a father's fading light. Camilla came later that evening, her composure as steady as ever, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. The queen consort had stood by the king through every treatment, every sleepless night, and every carefully phrased public statement meant to soothe the nation's worry. Now, in the sanctuary of Balmoral, she allowed herself brief moments of vulnerability. Once, when she believed no one was watching, she lingered outside the king's room, pressing a hand to the doorframe, her lips moving in silent prayer. The woman who had faced decades of scrutiny now faced the one battle she could not help him fight. And then, quietly, without ceremony, came the final arrival. A car appeared at the gates just after midnight. The door opened, and Prince Harry stepped out. There was no announcement, no public acknowledgement, but the cameras stationed far beyond the perimeter caught the faint glow of headlights cutting through the fog. His arrival sent ripples across the media and waves of emotion across Britain. For a moment, Even those long divided by loyalty or opinion shared the same thought, that in the end, blood mattered more than distance. Inside Balmoral, the brothers did not speak immediately. The air between them carried years of silence and misunderstanding. But when William looked at Harry, he saw not conflict, but the reflection of shared pain. For one night, the titles, intentions faded. They were not heirs or exiles. They were sons, gathered under one roof, awaiting the same unspoken truth. The royal family had come home not for a ceremony, but for goodbye. The announcement came on a gray afternoon when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Reporters had been called to the palace with little notice. Cameramen adjusted their lenses, murmuring in low voices as tension rippled through the crowd. 4 hours, speculation had filled every corner of Britain. Was it finally time? Had the inevitable moment arrived? Then, as the heavy wooden doors opened, Prince William stepped forward. His expression alone told the story before a single word was spoken. He looked pale, the weight of sleepless nights visible in the lines around his eyes. There was no ceremonial grandeur, no scripted pomp, only a podium, a sea of flashing lights, and a silence so thick it seemed almost sacred. Catherine stood just behind him, her gaze steady but distant. The young heir adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice that carried both strength and grief, he began. "My father's condition has worsened," he said slowly, every syllable deliberate, heavy with sorrow. "We are preparing for what lies ahead." The words hung in the air like a tolling bell, signaling the end of an era before it had officially come. Cameras clicked, flashes broke the quiet, and yet no one moved. It was as if the entire nation had frozen, suspended between hope and heartbreak. William paused, swallowing hard, his eyes glistening, though he refused to let the tears fall. "The king has faced his illness with grace and courage," he continued. "He remains surrounded by family and by love." His voice wavered, and for the first time, the mask of royal composure cracked. It was not the confident statesman the public had grown accustomed to, but a son standing before the world, trying to hold himself together while everything inside him was breaking. Behind the cameras, veteran reporters lowered their microphones, suddenly aware that they were witnessing not just history, but humanity. The man before them was no longer only the future king. He was the boy who had once walked behind his mother's coffin, now facing another unbearable loss. The cycle of royal duty and grief had come full circle. The press conference lasted only a few minutes, but its impact was immediate and immeasurable. News outlets across the globe broke into live coverage. Headlines flashed in every language. Crowds began to gather outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, laying flowers as if instinctively preparing for mourning. Church bells did not yet toll, but the silence of the people spoke volumes. After the statement, William stepped away from the podium, his composure finally faltering. Catherine reached for his hand, and together they disappeared behind the curtained doorway. The cameras lingered, desperate for one more glimpse, but the moment had passed. That day, Britain saw not just a future monarch, but a grieving son bound by duty. In 12 words, he had changed the tone of a nation. The world now waited, united in sorrow, suspended in time for the inevitable words that would one day follow. The king is gone. It began quietly, as moments of history often do. The afternoon sky over London was colorless, heavy with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Then the bells began to toll. Their deep, mournful sound rolled through the streets, echoing across the Thames and into the hearts of millions. Crowds started gathering outside Buckingham Palace. Men in dark coats, mothers clutching children, elderly couples holding hands as if bracing for what they already knew. Some carried candles, others held flowers. None spoke above a whisper. The silence itself had become an act of devotion. Television screens across the country flickered with images of the king through the years. His laughter at garden parties, his solemn speeches beneath grand chandeliers, his quiet moments feeding birds at Highgrove. Every frame seemed to tell the same story: a man who had given his entire life to duty, now facing the one battle even kings cannot command. Anchors spoke softly, their usual sharp tones replaced with reverence. The words, "critical condition," lingered on their lips, but no one dared to say what everyone feared most. In homes from Cornwall to Edinburgh, families gathered around their televisions as if around a vigil. People who had never met the king wept openly. Others clasped their hands in prayer, eyes lifted toward heaven. Social media overflowed with tributes, old photographs, and trembling words of gratitude. Even critics fell silent, replaced by a shared recognition that an era was drawing its final breath. The monarchy, that ancient, fragile institution, was now holding its heartbeat in unison with its ailing sovereign. Outside the palace gates, the crowd grew thicker by the hour. The scent of flowers filled the air, mingling with the chill of the evening. Someone began to sing "God Save the King," and others joined, their voices trembling, breaking, and rising again. Reporters stood among them, microphones lowered, realizing that for once, words were not enough. Across from the gates, a small boy placed a handwritten note on the ground. It read simply, "Thank you, Your Majesty." Inside the palace, the lights remained dim. Curtains were drawn. Guards stood with stoic expressions, but even they seemed subdued. The queen consort had requested privacy. Senior aides moved through the halls in hushed tones, their faces pale. The royal standard fluttered above the palace roof, illuminated against the darkening sky, a reminder that the king still lived, even as the nation collectively prayed that he might not suffer. News outlets interrupted regular programming. Churches opened their doors for midnight vigils. Candles were lit on every street corner. It was as if Britain had been transported back in time to an age when faith and sorrow intertwined. The sound of the bells carried through the night, solemn and haunting. By dawn, the nation waited in sacred stillness. The wind was cold, the sky unchanging. In that suspended moment between hope and farewell, Britain held its breath, knowing that when the next chime came, it might mark not just the passing of a king, but the end of a chapter in its very soul. Night had fallen over London, wrapping Buckingham Palace in a stillness that felt almost sacred. The city below shimmered faintly beneath a veil of mist, its lights flickering like candles in a chapel. Inside the palace, most of the staff had retired, their footsteps long faded into the distance. Only a few lamps glowed in the upper corridors, casting golden light against the marble floors. In one of the royal chambers, Prince William stood alone by the window, his reflection faintly visible against the dark glass. He looked out across the sleeping city, his future kingdom, and felt the crushing weight of what was coming. Behind him, through the half-closed door, came the faint rhythmic sound of the medical machines that kept his father stable through the night. It was a fragile sound, steady but uncertain, like a heartbeat that refused to surrender. The king slept under the watchful care of physicians, his breathing shallow yet calm. There was an aura of peace in the room, but it was the peace that comes before farewell. William knew it. Everyone knew it. And yet no one dared to say the words aloud. He pressed a hand against the cool glass, his thoughts drifting between the past and the future. For so long, the idea of being king had felt distant, a concept wrapped in ceremony and history. But now, standing there in the silence, it felt painfully real. He thought of his father's face earlier that evening, pale yet composed, as he whispered words that would stay with William for the rest of his life. "The crown is not power, my son," Charles had said softly. "It is a responsibility. It is love carried through service." The memory tightened his chest. Outside, Big Ben struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the city like solemn bells of destiny. The sound seemed to stir something deep within him, a mixture of grief, duty, and devotion. He could feel tears gathering, though he blinked them away. This was not the time to break. Not yet. Not while his father still drew breath. He whispered into the quiet, his voice barely more than air. "I promise, Father, I will not let what you built fade. I will serve them as you did, with patience, with grace, and with heart." The words trembled, but they were real. They were a vow born not of ambition, but of love. For a long while he stood there, the future pressing heavily upon his shoulders. The streets of London stretched endlessly beneath him, the same city his father had sworn to serve decades ago. Somewhere in those streets, people still prayed. Candles still burned. Hope still lived. When he finally turned from the window, he paused to look toward the doorway leading to his father's room. The king slept, his breathing faint but steady. William whispered once more, a final promise meant only for the stillness of the night. "Rest now, Father. When you can no longer carry the crown, I will. Then he walked away from the window, his shadow long and quiet across the floor, the image of a son stepping silently into destiny.